A couple of things I wanted to just throw in the discussion quickly from our previous discussions. Something Oppenheimer said after the war on this question of science versus engineering. He said, and it was, I suppose, said with a little edge, we didn't do any physics between 1939 and 1945.
Yeah, that's all it's.
And I think with the exception perhaps of measuring cross sections, that's just about true. It was a massive engineering project. And then the other comment, which is something that I've always treasured, that Shelby Foote once said in his books about this American Civil War, that it takes 100 years before you can write objectively about a war. I think we're just about coming up on that mark, so maybe we'll have a chance to move ahead. For me, the problem of the decision to drop the bomb has always turned again on this question of anachronism in historical writing and historical discussion. I know plenty of people, as I'm sure many of you do, who were involved in training for the invasion of Japan, who say, thank God for the atomic bomb. One of those people whom I particularly cherish knowing was the actor Paul Newman, who was the bombardier on a two-man Navy plane training for the invasion. He told me after I was saying something about using the bomb, he said, well, I was one of those guys who said, thank God, because I got to go home in one piece. There is that side of the story. And whether or not the bomb was the decisive event, or as I think we now understand, was one of the decisive events that contributed to the Japanese decision to surrender. I just learned that minutes ago, by the way. I had thought that Hasegawa's book basically said that it was the decision of the Soviet Union to invade that left the Japanese aware that they were surrounded on two sides by large and powerful armies, that led to the decision by the Japanese military to agree to unconditional surrender. But evidently what Hasegawa in fact says is that the bomb was one part of that story, which moves us, if we can assume for the moment that research is decisive, which moves us, I think, to part two of the argument about the use of the bomb, and that is, was it simply dropped to scare the Russians? Which I have always found a rather pernicious argument, frankly. When you look at the records of what Truman was thinking, when you look at what George Marshall had to say after the war about the American fury that the Japanese would not surrender when by all conventional terms of war fighting they had lost. They were down to about 1,000 calories per person of buckwheat and weeds per person in Japan. They were without an air force. They were without a navy. Their home islands had been blockaded. There was just simply no reason for them to continue fighting from a Western point of view. But it was a more intimate part of Japanese culture, perhaps, that led, well, it was the Japanese military leadership that didn't care how many civilians got killed along the way, if truth be told, that led them to hope that when the invasion inevitably came, there would be enough blooding of American forces that the United States would soften its position about unconditional surrender. So, and if there was a concern on the part of the U.S. military about the Soviet influence in Japan after the war, I have a feeling that that was reflected in the fact that the Air Force conducted its most intense bombing campaign on the 14th of August in northern Japan, where the Soviet forces, that was the direction the Soviet forces were moving, down from Sakhalin down to Hokkaido. That sounds to me like a bit of a warning to those forces, and I understand that the fighting went on in northern Japan until something like the 29th of August, just before the actual surrender ceremony. So we were concerned that we not have a situation in Japan like the situation in Germany of a divided country, half Soviet, half Western. That said, I frankly don't believe from the record that I've seen that the U.S. military was thinking about how the Soviets would respond. I think the U.S. military was thinking about how do we get this damned war over and stop killing people. And if truth be told, we saved a lot of Japanese lives too by ending the war when we did. How you tell this story when the pervasive story has become today, I mean, you know, school children have a module that they go through of the impeachment hearing, the impeachment trial of Harry Truman over his decision to drop the bomb. And I think Truman usually loses the impeachment trial and is impeached in those. That is sad to me, not because it's necessarily wrong, but because it is so totally ahistorical in terms of what was actually going on. It seems to me that there's a real opportunity here to present this information without necessarily taking sides, but to present all of the variety of elements that went into that intense final month, half a month of war around the atomic bombings that could easily call on all sorts of resources in an exhibit like this. And you know, as we've all talked, I'm sorry, I'm going on, but I'll stop in a moment. As we've all talked, a lot of these subjects that we've discussed present themselves beautifully as kind of modules, where there are specific artifacts, specific testimonies, specific documents that can be brought together to make a presentation that would be, as it were, a sub-module of this larger module that we're discussing. And a lot of history could be covered that way, in a really objective way, by basically letting the people visiting the museum have the same kind of experience that those of us who are historians have, of confronting the raw materials, confronting the documents and the images and the film and the letters and so forth, and get a sense of how you do that. Get a sense of just how really difficult it is to pull out of all of those diverse perspectives some kind of coherent sense of what actually happened. And if there's one subject that has engaged people since the end of the Second World War, it's certainly the decision to drop the bomb. At another level, this was the basic and definitive atomic bombing, and the only atomic bombing, these two were, in anger, that has ever happened. And there is an interesting question to ask about why we were able to do that then, and why no one has evidently felt able to do it since. That gets to the heart of the whole issue of deterrence. Not necessarily formal strategic deterrence, but elemental existential deterrence of the kind Niels Bohr was talking about. That's, I think, fundamental to the change in our relationship with the natural world that Bohr talked about as the thing that had happened as a result of the development, the discovery of this way to release nuclear energy. So, as seems to me so often true when you look at any piece of history, you can dig really, really deep if you just use your imagination a bit and are lucky enough to have the right documents and materials too. That's important. And get down to some very basic issues about war and peace and about science and how it works in the world. And this program, this particular event also lends itself beautifully to dramatization, to debates among the various positions, to the testimony of eyewitnesses, either in documents or alive, on video. All of that is there around this subject, and it's still very much an alive subject. So I see this as kind of the paradigmatic example of what kind of exhibit we could be doing. And when you think about this as the fundamental problem that came up about the Enola Gay, it's really exciting to think that there might be another way into the story that might make it possible for people to actually to think about it instead of to be emotionally blocked by their very strong feelings about it. Gentlemen, that's...
Okay, I'm up. All right. It's apparent that any exhibit that deals with the Manhattan Project has to deal with the question of the use of the atomic bombs against Japan. And it's also obvious, I think, that any discussion of this extremely controversial subject has to reflect current scholarship, which is exactly what the curators at the Air and Space Museum did in the early 1990s when they were planning the ill-fated Enola Gay exhibit. So the question is, and Richard just mentioned it, how do we approach this extremely controversial, extremely emotional issue in a way to avoid the questions or the comments and the outrage that followed the publication of the draft script of the Enola Gay exhibit. And this whole question, of course, is made even more difficult by the fact that the controversy swirls around counterfactuals. Most of the questions that arouse so much debate and so much controversy, and indeed so much ill will among scholars as well as apparently the general public, is based on counterfactuals. How long would the war have gone on? Did we have to use the bomb? What would have happened if the bomb hadn't been used? How long would the war have gone on? Would an invasion have been necessary? If an invasion had been necessary, how many casualties would have it exacted? How many lives were saved, American and Japanese lives, by the use of the bomb, if any? All of these questions are extremely important. They're extremely emotional, and they're basically questions that can't be answered because they're counterfactual. What I want to do in my time this afternoon is to talk briefly about the current state of the literature, because I am convinced that that's a necessary part of planning any exhibit on Truman's decision or non-decision, Truman's action in authorizing the use of atomic bombs against Japan. And basically, this controversy is centered on one question. And that question is, was the use of the bomb necessary to end the war on terms that were satisfactory to the United States? And there are two basic answers that have been given. This is a very polarized controversy, as you know, and the two basic poles are one on the one side. I guess I should put it on the right side here. My right is that, and this is the one that those of us of a certain age grew up with as revealed fact, and that is the use of the bomb was absolutely necessary because the only alternative was an invasion of the Japanese mainland that was going to take hundreds of thousands of American lives. The other pole of the debate, and I'll use my left hand here, is that no, that's wrong. The bomb was not necessary. Japan was on the verge of surrender. Japan was trying desperately to surrender on the sole basis that the emperor be allowed to remain on his throne, presumably as a constitutional monarch, and that Truman used the bomb not because there was any military necessity, but for other reasons. And the reason that's given most often is that he used it to impress and to intimidate the Soviets in the emerging Cold War. So those are the poles of the debate, and those are basically the issue around which the debate has been carried on by scholars. There are fundamental problems with both of these interpretations. The traditional view that Truman used a bomb because it was the only alternative to an invasion that would have caused hundreds of thousands of American, sometimes Truman and others say casualties, sometimes they said deaths, but huge numbers, totally unacceptable numbers. And there's a couple of major flaws with that approach. One is that there were other ways that the war could have ended. There are other ways that the war would probably have ended. The invasion was not scheduled until the 1st of November 1945, just about 3 months after the bombing of Hiroshima. And in that time, there were many other ways in which the war might have ended, and in my mind, probably would have ended. So it wasn't a question of using the bomb in August versus authorizing an invasion in November that would have been absolutely necessary. It's clear from the sources that when Truman's top advisors talked about the invasion, and it was something that they wanted to avoid. I mean, it was a horrible prospect to have to invade the Japanese mainland, but they talked about it in conditional terms. If the invasion becomes necessary, if we have to invade Japan, if such and such happens and we have to invade, it was always conditional. No one ever thought it was inevitable. So that's a major flaw with the traditional view, along with the fact that they that not only don't they recognize the fact or acknowledge the fact that there were other ways that the war could well have ended, but they don't try to explain why the use of the bomb was the most appealing alternative. And there were reasons for that. The other alternatives all had severe drawbacks, and the bomb seemed in many ways to be an ideal solution because it didn't have the drawbacks of the other ways in which the war could well end. The other problem with the traditional view is that, that there's no evidence, and there's a whole lot of controversy about this issue, the issue of casualty estimates. There is no evidence that I have ever seen, no convincing evidence that I have seen that Truman was ever told that if he had to authorize an invasion of Kyushu starting around the 1st of November 1945, that worst case it would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties or deaths. He was told numbers that were much smaller than that, but there's no evidence that he was ever presented by his advisors. And again, as we talked about this morning, Truman was heavily dependent on what he heard from his senior advisors, and especially his most trusted advisors. And there's no evidence that they ever told him, Mr. President, you have a stark choice between authorizing the bomb or authorizing an invasion that's going to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. It just didn't happen that way. And frankly, it astonishes me that there are still some scholars who insist that that's the case. The evidence and what we know about conditions in Washington as well as in Tokyo, I think make it clear beyond doubt that it just wasn't the case. All right, there are also what I view as major flaws in the revisionist position. First of all, and we now have a lot more Japanese sources than we had before the emperor died in the late 1980s, and scholars who are able to use the Japanese sources, and these are not scholars who were necessarily or in any way supportive of the use of the bomb or fans of Harry Truman. But they have concluded from Japanese sources that the Japanese were not ready to surrender, that they had not decided to surrender, that the Japanese had not reached a point where they had decided to surrender. And that knocks out a major crutch of the revisionist position because it's based on the argument that the Japanese were trying to surrender. The Japanese sources, and from what we know of other sources, indicates that simply was not the case. And scholars who have used Japanese sources also indicate that even if we had offered to guarantee the status of the emperor, even if we had made a statement to Japan in the Potsdam Proclamation or in some other context, we're going to allow the emperor to remain, that this would have convinced the Japanese to surrender, and that again has been a major part of the revisionist argument. If only we had assured the Japanese that they could keep the emperor, then Japan would have surrendered. Japanese sources seem to indicate otherwise. And furthermore, the Japanese, up until the time that they actually surrendered, when they talked about retaining the emperor, they did not talk about retaining the emperor as a kind of a friendly constitutional monarch. When this issue was discussed within the Japanese cabinet and among Japanese officials, when they talked about retaining the emperor, what they talked about or what they thought about, and this includes the emperor himself, was to keep the emperor as a divine ruler. And this, of course, was totally unacceptable to the U.S. or anyone else who was allied with the United States in trying to end the war. So everybody wanted to end the war. That was the first priority, but not on conditions that were unacceptable. And it's also clear from the sources that Truman and his advisors did not believe that the Japanese were ready to surrender, and there's a lot of sources, but the most clear is a memo from General John Weckerling, who was Marshall's chief intelligence officer, who addressed this issue and said, there's just no evidence that the Japanese are ready to surrender. It would be nice if there were such evidence, but there's no evidence whatsoever that the emperor has decided that the war must end on conditions that are acceptable to us. So both of these polar interpretations, I think, are seriously flawed. And the state of scholarship now, and I'm talking about books that have been written in the last 10 or 15 years, come out somewhere between. And so the question then becomes, well, where in between? And that varies a whole lot. And there are still lots of questions that are debated among scholars. Certainly, at least to my knowledge, there is no consensus of opinion on a lot of secondary issues. But there are on the main issues, and that is that the bomb was necessary to end the war as quickly as possible, that the Soviet invasion was also a major influence. The bomb and the Soviet invasion combined were essential to force the Japanese to surrender promptly after August 6th and after August 9th. And lots of other issues are still subjects of sharp debate, such as the relative influence of the bomb versus the Soviet invasion, the impact, if any, of the bombing of Nagasaki, and the casualty issue. And so there's lots to argue about. But I think in terms of planning for exhibits, in terms of trying to get the scholarship right, I think it's important to realize that, one, this issue is very controversial, two, it's very emotional. But that scholars, and I'm talking about really good scholars whose work I have a great deal of respect for, and they come out somewhere in between. And even better, the decibel level of the debate has been reduced to reasonable proportions, and I think that's all good. And maybe by the time a new exhibit, this exhibit, is ready, maybe we will have reached a point where we can talk about these issues and disagree, but do it in a civilized way. And if we can do that, then that's major progress. Thank you.
So I wanted to talk about three kind of tactical, in Alan's words, tactical approaches to controversy. All right, thank you. The listening and watching audience. So to talk about three kind of tactical approaches that might deal with controversy, and in the context of three exhibits, which I've picked out of the air as of having had some effect on me, and one you've heard of it, which is Understanding Race, or rather Race, Are We So Different, which was done by the American Anthropological Association and developed and produced by the Science Museum of Minnesota. But the first one I'd like to talk about is Wolves and Humans, which was done also by Minnesota back in '85. At the time when there was very big discussions about whether wolves should be reintroduced to the northern states. And it was extremely controversial at the time. And of course, there were Twin Cities, very liberal and environmental, was all in favor of this kind of restoring nature. And the people up on the north, the people who were the farmers and the hunters and whatnot, were really opposed to it. We were able to develop an exhibition that allowed both sides to speak. So in this case, through videos, and then allow people to kind of react to those speeches. So later on, when people asked, well, how did the exhibit work for people? we heard from both sides that they liked the way their side was presented in the exhibit. They may not have agreed with everything, right? And I think that the tactic here is with controversy is to try to avoid the museum voice. So often museums present or tend to present everything as kind of from on high. This is the way it was, and they use all of their authority and their formal language to do that. Whereas with something like decision to drop the bomb, I think we need to let people who were arguing it speak for themselves. I mean, it's really about what you were saying, Richard, to try to confront people with the sources, sources of history, and in as much as possible let people speak for themselves. The second exhibit is from the National Museum of American History. It was done in '87, called A More Perfect Union, which was about Japanese American internment, as you know, also in World War II. In '39, it was actually in '41, right after Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt signed an order to remove everybody from the western states of Japanese descent. So these were Americans, many second generation or more, were moved to internment camps in the Midwest, this, I think, and eventually, I think maybe after this exhibit, there was an apology actually given by President Ford, right? Maybe that was right, but it was before the exhibit was done. There was an apology to the Japanese given to the Japanese citizens. This obviously was a terrible thing for many people because they were forced to sell all their possessions at substantial losses.
Reparations too. I thought
there were some reparations too, but it's not a lie. I have a good friend who was actually born into one of these camps, and his parents were kind of forced to work, who were merchants in the West Coast, were forced to work in a truck farm in New Jersey. So they had to get out of the camp. They had to do this. I felt that the exhibition was extremely powerful, and because it let people talk with their own words, that it gave the stories, it gave the individuals and their own pictures of the camps, pictures of and stories of what went on there, artifacts, and then at the same time it really talked about the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court negotiations. I guess it never got to be a real decision from the Supreme Court, other than, well, we're not going to interfere right now, and it never got up to be a full decision. I think even at the end, because of deaths and settlements and things like that. But a very powerful technique. And race, we've mentioned. You've mentioned a couple of times. I think of exhibits in the Dewey sense. Education isn't something you pour into anybody, into somebody, right? Education has to be kind of a transaction between a teacher and a learner, or between two learners, that involves, I think, change on both sides to be meaningful anyway. And in the race exhibit, we used a technique called talking circles, which was used. We would get, after people went through the exhibit, we would get about 20 people with a facilitator to sit around in a circle and kind of use a rule that, as it were, pass a talisman, and only the talisman person got to speak. I think we didn't actually do that, but one person speaking at a time, to talk about their own reactions to the exhibit and what race really was. This became it's difficult to do because it's staff intensive. I mean, we paid these presenters. It was in demand. It required lots of logistics for managing space, but we had companies in Minnesota when it was at our place. We had companies who would send their employees there to go through the exhibit and then go through this talking circle experience, so that they could reflect together. And I think that means that when I say it's transactive, it means that it wasn't the presenter really giving a point of view. It was people exchanging point of views and points of view and interacting with each other. So I think in this kind of thing, we have to figure a way, in an exhibit about dropping the bomb, we have to figure a way where we can let people who are engaged in trying to understand this interact with each other, and hopefully maybe find a way of leaving something of themselves, of their process with the exhibit for others to take.
A comment going back to the question of using the bomb. I think it's really important that the issue of strategic bombing that precedes the decision to use the bomb be somehow incorporated into this debate and this module. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would already have been destroyed. They were deliberately taken off the target lists, along with several other Japanese potential targets, in order to preserve them for atomic bombing, so that we could study the effects of these bombs, which had never been dropped on occupied places before. So speaking of counterfactuals, if you say we didn't have any atomic bombs in time, and we knew that, let's say, by the summer of 44, they would simply have already been destroyed by Curtis LeMay and B-29s. What does that say about the whole debate? It really raises some very interesting questions. And perhaps more to the point, and maybe more relevant for an exhibit, it's very important not only to the dropping of the bombs, but also to the subsequent history of nuclear weapons. These bombs were not more destructive than the equivalent firebombing campaigns that had preceded them. The most destructive attack on Japan wasn't Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the first big firebombing of Tokyo in, I think, April of 45. March, when at least 150,000 people died, and there are estimates of casualties up around the 500,000 mark, and I mean seriously injured casualties. Or you can look, of course, at Dresden or Hamburg or the cities in Europe. And the bomb was deliberately designed to explode high enough in the air, deliberately triggered to explode high enough in the air that it would not churn up soil with its fireball and make a lot of radioactivity. The assumption was that the prompt radioactivity of the fireball would kill people who would have been killed by blast anyway. Whether that actually worked out quite that way, I don't think it did. But the point is, there was every effort made to make this bomb as conventional in its effects as possible, which tells you again the general thinking that this, from a military point of view, is just another weapon of war, which is kind of, I think, what President Truman was doing when he really never quite decided to use it. He just released it for the military's use and any subsequent weapons of its type. There is, at the other extreme, the fact that there were discussions between Robert Oppenheimer and General Groves of ways to make a lot of bombs quickly by making composite cores or whatever. I saw a memo from Oppenheimer to Groves saying with composite plutonium and uranium cores in an implosion weapon, we could have 6 per month by October. Imagine how we'd be thinking about that debate if that had happened. It's pretty clear that we were going to substitute atomic bombing in the classic air tradition of using strategic bombing to replace troops on the ground as a way of preventing the invasion and as a way of forcing the Japanese either to surrender or die, I suppose. I guess it would work for modern museum visitors to sit down and talk about these issues. I hope they would be adequately prepared, because it's so, if you will, alien to our very peaceful, relatively peaceful world where most young people don't even think about nuclear weapons, where a lot of Americans think we got rid of all our nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War. Logically enough, we should have, but we didn't. So I don't know how people would handle this issue, and I think the exhibit will have to somehow prepare them to have this discussion in a meaningful context of endless loss of lives of our troops and their troops, and death and death and death until we were just fed up and ready to do whatever we needed to do to put an end to this god-awful war. You know, there's a famous discussion that went on between Jimmy Burns, the Secretary of State, and Harry Truman, two good Southern politicians. Burns saying to Truman, "Mr. President, what will you say at your impeachment trial when they ask you why, when you had a weapon that might have ended the war and saved American lives, you chose not to use it?" And I'm sure that was an important influence on Truman. That was a political issue. That was a personal issue.
Yeah, I might add to that in Truman's mind, he didn't have to be told in early August of 1945 that the bomb would save hundreds of thousands of American lives. If Truman had been told, as he probably was, it's going to save American lives, that's all that mattered. It didn't matter if it was 100,000 or 300,000 or 50.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced that if somebody had asked or said to Truman, "Mr. President, you can either use the bomb or sacrifice an extra half dozen American lives," he would have said, "Drop the bomb."
Absolutely.
Drop the bomb. It would have been a very, very low number. I mean, it's counterfactual to the extreme to speculate, but that was his concern. And he didn't have to be told that the bomb would save hundreds of thousands of lives. That was something that came later, and there's just no evidence to support the claim that he was told the bomb would save hundreds of thousands of lives.
I would just add to that I've spoken with Japanese who were around at that time who said, "Thank God for the atomic bomb," who said, "A lot more of us would have died had you not dropped those weapons." I don't think they were just being polite. I think they had a sense, too, that their military leadership was prepared to sacrifice as many civilians as necessary to reach the terms that they hoped they could reach with the United States. And that raises another question that we haven't discussed at all in any context today, but I want to raise it just because it's bucket of worms though it is. It's an interesting question. Is there a way to bring the Japanese into this exhibit?
Good question.
They are a part of this story too. You only have to visit Hiroshima on August 6th to realize how much this whole event meant to them as well. It's an extraordinary experience to stand in the Peace Park when the entire city just stops for 1 minute while the bells ring and the streetcars stop and the cars stop and everything stops, and then they release the 1,000 pigeons and life goes on. But don't know what to say about that except that's there sitting on the table.
That was of course a major issue for the Enola Gay, because they did bring in the Japanese, and that was a real strike against.
Right. Well, I'm sure it would be.
That he had done that, and
but
they said he was making.
No official top government American representative has ever attended the peace ceremonies on August 6th.
The ambassador has been there the last 2 years.
Ambassador has? Oh, good.
I think last year, yeah.
Good.
I think for the first time.
I know we're inching our way towards dealing with that, but somehow to include that would be a step in the right direction. If it doesn't crash the whole project, that's the problem.